Get connected. Burn the bots.
Now, we all want to eliminate poverty, or at least we should, if not out of compassion for the downtrodden, then out of self-interest. That's because poverty produces factional conflict and crime. Not my idea, Aristotle's. It's obvious that what we're doing in the developing world isn't working. International development is full of these big ideas, these big interventions that we hope will end poverty once and for all, but I don't think that's realistic. I think we need to have a bit of humility about our contribution so far. Now, as Dambisa mentioned, the West has spent $1 trillion on aid in Africa, and globally it's more than twice that. But we haven't really gotten results that we wanted. I don't actually want to spend all my time talking about the failures of aid. Human beings, despite our frailty, have an amazing capacity for resistance and for overcoming our challenges. We're makers of tools, and that's what I really want to talk about. Now, we've spent these $2 trillion on official development assistance, and that seems like a big number until you consider that it's just a small fraction of the wealth that people in developing countries have managed to amass during that same period. Two of our most important development thinkers right now, Mohamed Yunus and Hernando de Soto, have laid out some ideas for how we can change the equation in developing countries, how we can give people access to their own capital and allow them to work their way out of poverty. I think these insights are important, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we might be able to apply them. De Soto estimates that assets held informally by the poor, their homes and their businesses, are worth at least $9 trillion in replacement value. This means that the poor themselves should be able to deploy capital far in excess of what we can deliver to them in the form of aid. Nobel laureate Mohamed Yunus, through his pioneering work on microfinance, showed us that the poor are entrepreneurs, that they can use capital effectively to build businesses. Now, the key question is not how can we give them more charity, but how do we create the tools that will make charity unnecessary? Both of these big ideas that I've been discussing have received their fair share of criticism, and sometimes for good reason. De Soto's property rights reform programs depend on aid money channeled through governments which use the fear of eviction to maintain control and silence dissent. The UN tells us that 50% of the population of Kabul, Afghanistan is under eviction notice right now. This is nothing more than a protection racket. How can that government or governments like it elsewhere in the world be expected to implement a titling program in good faith? Uncertainty and fear are politically useful for illegitimate governments, and as it turns out, very lucrative for the special interests that have captured the machinery of the state. Frederick Douglass, an American civil rights advocate and the contemporary of Abraham Lincoln, wrote that power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. And I think that real progress on governance reforms only occurs when organizations arise to channel and articulate the demands of the population. Land titling is one example I'm familiar with of how elites and professionals and bureaucrats collude to enrich themselves at the expense of the population. Just to give you an idea of how this game is played, many countries still require that all property mapping be performed by licensed professionals with 4-year degrees in surveying. Now, this makes sense in some places where property values are very high, but in general, when we're talking about rural areas, it doesn't work. They impose these complex and costly regulations on the process, and some countries actually mandate the use of outdated technology, traditional surveying equipment, and the creation of paper maps, even though we've had game-changing advances in satellite positioning technology and computer mapping. Land Registry Office in Zimbabwe in 2008 boasted a staff of 3 trained surveyors and a backlog of 15,000 requests for service. Now you can expect that these guys are well compensated for their attention when they do go out into the field. In Jamaica, a country of 3 million with an estimated 500,000 informally held parcels, there are around 75 registered surveyors. On top of that, every land transaction requires a participation of 3 lawyers, the buyer's lawyer, the seller's lawyer, and the government's lawyer. For the transfer of a small parcel, it's not unusual for the survey costs, taxes, lawyers' fees, and bribes to eat up 25% of the value of the property. These transaction costs and the hassles associated with legal compliance drive even people with legal land claims to opt out of the formal system. They're forced to hide their economic lives from the view of the state. Now, when we talk about informality, we're saying that the assets and the people who own them are literally undocumented. There's nothing that defines their existence in the view of the state and within the legal system. No accurate description of the salient features or the unique identifier that's been created by a government or some other third-party organization. For a person, we might mean name, height, eye color, date of birth. For a piece of property, we're talking about boundary coordinates, a transaction history, estimated value, address. Now, this legal invisibility is sometimes deliberate, but it's not without costs. Land theft in the absence of well-defined rights is a chronic problem. Transactions concerning property, when they're even possible, are risky. And for the purposes of our discussion, it's impossible to leverage assets by borrowing against equity. This final point brings us to Muhammad Yunus and the microfinance movement. We in the developed world have been hearing a lot about the dangers of debt and the evils of credit. Some critics of microfinance have even suggested that we might be condemning people in the developing countries to the same fate as subprime borrowers in the United States. I don't think these arguments hold water. Traditional microloans, even at 50 or 100% a year, are a great opportunity for many people. They're certainly better than the loan sharks that they might be dealing with in the local market, which can charge 10% a day or more. Microfinance institutions do many things well. They trim costs to the bone, they educate their borrowers, and they do aggressive outreach. Their rates, however, are too high to finance housing and many other kinds of long-term businesses. If you're paying 50% a year, obviously the amount of principal that you can take out is relatively small. Now, the reason that microfinance organizations have been running up against this barrier in terms of how low they can bring their interest rates is that almost no microfinance organizations are able to make secured loans. Now, credit allocation is based on the 3 C's: character, cash flow, and collateral. Character and cash flow loans are always subject to the problem of voluntary default. There's no way around it, and that risk has to be priced in even if repayment rates are relatively high. So when these organizations go for wholesale funding, they're simply paying more for it, and they pass that on to their borrowers. Now, a business that's paying more for its capital, which is a key component, a key cost for a business, is just not going to be able to compete head-to-head with a business that's operating on secured capital. So the poor are put at a disadvantage just by the structure of how we, deliver financial services to them. The world is now slowly recovering from an economic meltdown that's caused by mortgage securitization, and so it may seem like a strange time to be talking about micro-mortgages and tapping private capital markets. But I believe that the future of the mortgage market is going to look more like the top picture than the bottom picture. There are a couple reasons for that. The first is that I think we're learning from this crisis. It's been a profound teachable moment for us. We've learned about how much we rely on credit to be able to start businesses, buy homes, and smooth consumption through rough patches. But it also has taught us about the specific technical aspects of bundling mortgages so that we're better at it. I think that the process is going to resume on a stronger foundation, and that developed world mortgages may not even be as attractive to investors as the developing world mortgages in a few years. That's because these virgin markets will offer higher interest rates, they'll offer lower loan-to-value ratios, and let's face it, a built-in hedge against dollar depreciation. Now, I've already showed you how Yunus and DeSoto are compatible. Now I want to talk about why it's actually essential to combine their ideas. Consider that microfinance organizations can spend as much as $200 to recruit a new customer and create an account for them. This figure is in the ballpark of the price per title that donor-funded land registry programs I've evaluated. I think we can do better than $200 on both fronts, but let's say for the moment that it's the true cost. It's a lot of money, particularly when you're working in societies where people are living on $1 a day. Now, there's a reason these costs are similar. It turns out that the data you would need to collect to issue a mortgage loan and the data you need to collect to issue a title are virtually identical. Not only that, but the target market of most microfinance organizations is precisely untitled landholders. Now, if you could unify data collection processes and use the networks created by MFIs to reach out to customers, you could eliminate a costly duplication of efforts and offer informal landholders an attractive service package. You could also reduce the cost borne by users by making the most of the database that you're creating. Obviously, demographic and consumer data are useful to governments and to utility providers, but as we've learned, they're also useful to advertisers and to real estate professionals and to researchers. The same structured information can support many different applications, different user interfaces that perform functions like credits and debits to a bank account, or land transactions, or simply mapping and creating accurate road atlases for areas that are off the grid. Now, we know that this idea, on a basic level, the unification of titling and lending to create secured micromortgages, works in the field. We know it because it's already being done on a pilot basis by the Clinton Global Initiative in Ghana. When I spoke with the head of the project back in Washington, he was even surprised with how well it had been received in the field. He told me that when he went up to people in Ghana in the outskirts of Accra, and he was explaining that they were going to help them get their titles to their land and maybe get financing, they looked at him like he was from Mars. They were like, we've been trying to do this for years, and nobody can figure out how to work through the system. It's just been impossible for us. And now, this organization comes in and is able to use its political clout to negotiate with the government so that they can actually have their land rights respected and documented. Now, the problem with this idea, as we look at implementing it globally, is not technical so much as political. Local government has accepted the land declarations, but it doesn't really know what to do with them. There's no sort of system in place to manage title data. And for the first time, owners have documents in their hands that show their assets on the map, but there's no sort of legal system that has been constructed which will allow them to make transactions and sort of have predictability over time. It's time that developing country governments got with the program here and came to terms with the fact that 4 or 5 billion households, or 4 or 5 billion people, 1 billion households, who have most of their savings tied up in land and in the investments they've made, are not going to be moved off. Right? We have whole cities of squatters, like the Dharavi slum in Mumbai, which is home to 1 million people, and every developing country faces the same double bind. They can't get rid of these neighborhoods, these slums, because there are too many people in them, but they also can't be treated as normal homeowners because the law says that the land underneath their feet belongs to the state or to some other person. Now, in some cases, governments take actions in the name of justice and progress which disregard or destroy the investments of sweat and treasure that their citizens have made. The near total collapse of Zimbabwe's economy has been marked by disregard not just for the investments of white commercial farmers, but of black smallholders. Mugabe's bulldozers have been leveling poor neighborhoods around the country, and the government continues to prohibit property transactions on rural land. The results have been predictably disastrous for the people there. I recently traveled to East Timor, which, like Zimbabwe, has had a number of displacements in its recent past. And when they voted for independence in 1999, Indonesian militias destroyed most of the buildings in the capital and specifically targeted land records for destruction. East Timor is now the poorest country in Asia, and the government is finding it impossible to implement a land titling system which will sort of resolve all of the competing claims from the Indonesian and the Portuguese legal systems. However, this is actually kind of a happy story for the people in East Timor, because when a donor-funded program began investigating land tenure around the country, they found that less than 10% of the parcels they surveyed were in conflict. Half of those conflicts were with the state, and another half were intra-family. So really, you only have 2.5% of the land they looked at, which is disputed between neighbors. This is a remarkable story of self-governance, of communities spontaneously coming together to work out the problems that they have and implementing informal legal systems that adjudicate conflicts. Our own history in North America is one of governments validating squatters' rights around the country for communities that had already agreed among themselves. This local agreement is the hard part. The real danger in East Timor and Zimbabwe and Colombia and Liberia and India is that the government will come in and try to impose some other allocation of land. The only approach to the problem of land rights that doesn't involve large-scale violence, destruction, and displacement is to grant title to the actual occupants of land. So when we saw communities successfully managing land rights, successfully working through these problems, we asked, what can we do to ensure that their own governments will respect their allocations? How do we ensure that expropriation can't go unnoticed and uncompensated? We thought about how we create an organization, a tool that they can use, a clearinghouse for data about land and about credit, which would allow them to defend themselves from the predations of the state. Now, my firm and others have been experimenting with low-cost digital mapping technologies, data publication solutions, which would allow us to provide a simple mapping toolkit to these communities or to the MFIs and NGOs that are working in them. And we would then host and publish the compilations of their land claims, a cadastral map, a transaction registry, a credit bureau, which would help them manage these lending and transaction processes over time. It would also allow them to negotiate with their government for formal recognition of their claims, because apparently these governments are unable to go out into the field and collect this data themselves. Now, even now, many governments around the world, particularly in Europe, are updating their cadastral maps and trying to go digital, spending billions of dollars to improve their systems and update their cadasters. However, much of this work is actually redundant, and it rarely includes large-scale mapping of informal communities. Rather than throwing money away replicating the registry systems for every country and municipality in the world, we need to do it once and do it right. European countries are leading the world in cadastral mapping and land registry. And to give you an example, the government of Spain recently launched an interactive online cadaster based on the Google Maps application programming interface. And it works perfectly. But why build this system hundreds of times as the developing world slowly accepts this technology? It's largely a matter of adding more servers to accommodate new ownership data from communities around the world, and we can start right now. In general, we as development practitioners have to get better at spotting the systems that are actually working, that can easily scale, and then we run with them. We don't need to reinvent the wheel in each of these countries. A Newsweek article back in 2003 told us that the main source of rising unemployment and stagnant economies in the Arab world, which is the same thing as saying the source of Islamic extremism if we believe Aristotle, is the chronic illiquidity, a lack of modern financial tools to lure cash out of burgeoning black markets. The challenge today is how to revitalize those dormant financial systems and harness the Arab world's huge reservoir of unreported capital, unquote. As we've seen, this is not a problem unique to the Arab world. It's a problem for something like 80% of the population of this planet. And I hope we can get to work on building these tools sooner rather than later. Thanks.
Thank you.